Hello and welcome to the first of our Architects panel presentations on Shaw. My name is Chris Gower. I'm the chair of the Vancouver Island chapter of Architects, and this is the first tonight of a series of panels that we've recorded over the last 2 years. I'm working with Martin Segger, who's an old professor and friend, who's kind of the other side of a coin that we'll be looking at in the presentation tonight. So Martin, please.
Thanks, Chris, and pleased to be here.
We enjoy these things, and Martin and I were the co-presenters for the first panel that you'll see tonight. But it's one of a series of panels that were organized over a 2-year period involving different groups of architects and specialized speakers. We recorded these Zoom presentations, and they were so successful we've decided to turn them into public presentations through Shaw. So I'll just list the titles of the presentations to give you an idea of the diversity. The first one you'll see tonight is a discussion of urban conservation and urban design, a balance for the past and the future, Martin and I. Our next series were 2 presentations on housing and homelessness. Panel discussions, first of all, with a community experts panel, followed by a panel of architects. And the first panel laid out the challenges of housing and homelessness. And the second panel of architects kind of took on possible responses. The discussions were really quite probing and really cut to the marrow, I think, of quite a difficult kind of challenge for our society. The next 2 panel discussions were concerned with climate change in Vancouver Island and in general. And again, in the first panel we had an experts panel outlining the challenges and the hurdles that climate change is a prospect for all of us in the future. And the second panel of architects considered responses of past projects, current projects, and future projects to how we begin to come to grips with the hurdles of climate change. So we do have a following presentation that we're aiming for this fall on seismic issues. And Martin is spearheading this. So Martin?
Yes, Chris. Well, I have been working very closely with a group of local citizens to investigate the feasibility of listing Victoria as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And as part of that, we've been looking at the risks to Victoria's heritage. And high up among those risks is seismic, the risk of extensive damage to the fabric, historical fabric of Victoria through a seismic event. And this would include, I mean, if you think about it, everything from the Parliament buildings to the Empress Hotel, our historic churches, the unreinforced masonry buildings of Old Town, our schools. So you can see the importance of this topic. And we're delighted to link with the professional architects to develop a discussion, which we will happy to share with the general public, on how we identify these risks and how we mitigate them. So we're pleased to work with the architects and also the Hallmark Society in making this a public event through the auspices of Shaw.
Thanks, Martin. So we may look in beyond these presentations. We're very proud with the material that we've assembled so far, and we may find that this reaches further into the future. So we're hoping to inaugurate quite a good range of public discussions, and Shaw Cable has been extremely useful and supportive for this as well. So we're very grateful to them. So the first presentation tonight, it happens to join Martin's side of the coin and the architect's side of the coin. We look at urban conservation and also urban planning and urban design. So how do you balance the past, the future, and change in a city? And Martin, do you have any other lead-in thoughts?
Well, I think it was a think piece, really. The two of us put together our thoughts and our different perspectives on the legacy of Victoria's heritage, particularly its built heritage. and how that has created a sense of place for Victoria, and also given us a narrative, a community narrative that by which we identify ourselves as citizens. And so what comes into play here is how you bring that heritage forward into contemporary urban design, and how you embed those heritage values and stories as you continue to build out the city. And this was Chris's contribution to our discussions on that topic.
So once again, thanks very much to Martin. I also note again that this is a co-presentation of the Vancouver Island Chapter of Architects of the AIBC and the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada's Victoria Network. So thank you all very much.
Martin is Professor Martin Segger, a Professor Emeritus of UVic. He's an architectural historian, well known in Victoria. He has served 2 terms as a City of Victoria Alderman and Councillor during the establishment of Victoria's Heritage Conservation Program. He's also authored several books on Victoria's built history, and most recently, Conservation Guidelines for Modernist Architecture in the Victoria region. He is currently project coordinator for the community-based initiative to nominate Victoria for inscription as a World Heritage Site under the cultural and landscape category. So thank you, Martin. Chris, I could almost say, is one of those people who needs no introduction. Most people know Chris, fixture in the architectural community here in Victoria and the province for many decades. Chris has acted as an architect, an urban design planner in the Victoria region for over 30 years, including an extended period in the City of Victoria as the community planning senior planner in urban design, with urban design responsibilities for the preparation of Victoria's downtown core plan and its official community plan. He has served on the organizing committees for 2 large community planning conferences in Victoria, the Visions Victoria Conference of 1989 and the Downtown 2020 Conference of 2002. And I'd be remiss to note that Chris is architect AIBC. He's a fellow of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, and he has an RPP, CIP, and LEED approved professional designation. So welcome and thank you both.
Well, thank you very much for the chapter to invite me to say some words at this session. And I'm always pleased to meet you guys. I do so with apologies. As you know, I'm an architectural historian. I couldn't design my way out of a paper bag, but that doesn't stop me having things to say about it. And so today I thought I'd take on the problem of facadism. And a couple of things, I suppose, before I start. First of all, what I'm talking about is really the public face of architecture, and in this session, particularly its intersection with heritage conservation. And to set us off, well, there we are. It's just what I said. Maybe to salvage the word facadism, because particularly as we use it in the heritage conservation business, it has all kinds of negative connotations attached to it, and those shared, I think, by many in the architectural design community. Facadism or facadonomy,
100%
yes, with its kind of a risque reference, and that word is used in Europe sometimes, is the architectural and construction practice where the facade of a building is designed or constructed separately from the rest of the building, or when only the facade of a building is preserved with new buildings erected behind it or around it. So that's what Wikipedia has to say. And what I would add is really that the facade mediates between the structure and the public, as opposed to an elevation, which is what you guys do. designing an exterior envelope. Adding facades onto buildings, an age-old practice, and a well-known one, if you're a Renaissance art historian, is Santa Croce in Florence, which finally got its facade in 1863. So a late facade on a 15th century building. And they had the wit when they added the facade to design it in the Italian Gothic, which would have been the style of the day had it been built then. Skin versus structure, I called it the curtain or curtain wall as we know it. Lever House building, which anyone who's been to architecture school or studied architectural history, we've all sat through the 20 or 40-minute lecture on the importance of Lever House. I won't get into that today, except that modernism, which celebrates, form follows function, was all about facades as well. And here you see it wrapped around the skyscraper on its podium in the middle of New York. What I'm going to do is just go through a quick, what I call typology of facadist practice, and particularly viewed from the point of view of the heritage conservationist, but I won't have a lot to say about these except that I didn't invent this. It's from an article which appeared a few years ago in Now magazine by Richard Langley called Facadism, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But it introduces us to some of the sort of principles around what is happening today and where facadism, I suppose, is going, or it's come, where for the most part, buildings, bits of buildings get inserted or applied into new design. And he calls this example facadism skin deep, where you've got in this case, the Toronto Stock Exchange facade retained in this, the new larger building. He calls this facadism framed, which just reminds us that current practice, you keep the facade, you put a totally new building inside, and while you do it, you support the exterior with a steel framework. You get old original facade, new building inside. So this gets carried to some extraordinary extremes today. In this case, the facade was dismantled and reconstructed around the corner of a brand new skyscraper tower, Adelaide Centre in Toronto. Here he calls this sticker facadism, where the facade of the original building is usually dismantled and then just applied as almost, well, here a postage stamp piece of it as the entrance to the new skyscraper building. And in this case here, the Bedford condo on Bloor retained is the facade is reconstructed as the entrance. But beyond that, we have facades treated as objects of art. And in this case, in Calatrava's Lambert Galleria, in the new shopping mall between Bay and Yonge Street, where the commercial bank is now literally retained as an art piece.
What we're doing, we do stock costs on
The applique facadism, where facades are literally, in this case, the modernist, stridently modernist facade, Leeskin's addition to the Royal Ontario Museum. And sometimes it can be an absolute disaster, functionally as well as aesthetically. In this case, I note the museum is already talking about when it can remove this extrusion on the historic Royal Ontario Museum. Huge curator revolution when they were asked to put exhibits inside Libskin's edition. He calls this death mask. And I put it in here because in this case, the facade was of the Royal Canadian Military Institute was actually destroyed totally. And this is an absolutely new replica of it to provide the entrance to the down hall. The only authentic piece is the cannons at the entrance, and even those, I presume, are heavily restored. And finally, the Graveyard of Lost Facades, which is Guild Park, Toronto, where you have bits and pieces of buildings, and in one case, a portico resurrected. And I know Hal's watching, he probably knows where this portico came from, and I did at one time, I've forgotten. So some principles then behind this. We've got, of course, where the modern intersects with the historic form follows function, the famous lines of Louis Sullivan. So facades of buildings should really speak about the building itself and be driven by its engineering, its form and mass. And then you have some of the principles which conservation community restores buildings according to. And in this case, the sort of core principle is explained or stated in the International Charter for the Conservation and Restoration of Monuments and Sites, known in short as the Venice Charter in 1964, and it gets a lot of reference. And what it essentially says is that you can replace missing parts of a historic building, but you have to make sure that you don't falsify any artistic or historic evidence, and it must be distinguishable for it. So in this case, the original monument drives or underpins anything and should visibly dominate anything that you do to the structure. So putting a high-rise curtain wall building over top of a historic structure is not on. The standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada, which is adopted as the articulating policy as to how we should approach buildings in the city of Victoria, as formally adopted by the cities in 2012, calls for us to conserve the heritage value and character defining elements when creating any new addition to a historic place or any related new construction. Make the new work physically and visually compatible with, supported to, and distinguishable from historic place. So this statement, of course, is driven by the principles in the Venice Charter. So we have a history of doing this in one way or another in the city. And in fact, one of the first conservation projects in the city undertaken by Peter Cotton was Johnson Street, the Grimm's Furniture Factory, which, as you can see here, well, when it was being renovated, the back end of the building was stripped out, and oops, we lost it. The facade fell down, so it was reconstructed. And Peter was very careful about what he did. He had the opportunity to go back to the original photographs, and you will see, if you compare the two, there are some differences. So what was constructed here was driven by the original structure, but not an absolute detailed replica. And then, of course, I go to the Driard Hotel, now part of the Bay Center, where we lost 2 blocks of historic buildings. 4 of them were reconstructed, literally applied to the concrete skin of the new conference center. I point this out, right, because this was probably the Donnybrook of facadism discussion and battle plans between developers, city, the Hallmark Society that led the charge on this. And the net result was literally a facadist monument where part of the hotel was reconstructed in this way. I've often pondered or wondered myself. I show you the original scheme proposed for the Driard Hotel in the 1890s by John Teague, and only half of it was actually built. So one could have had the opportunity of reconstructing the missing bit. That wasn't taken off. I don't think it was even constructed, but we can fantasize of what might have happened had that been done. The Dominion Post Office, which is very important because it is part of the great play of structures that surround the inner harbor and tell you the story of the city as its CPR, hotel, harbor, marine transport history, the Parliament buildings, the rise of the colony and its development becoming a province, and then the role of the federal government, which had to put up its monument here, the great post office built in 1894. So destroyed by fire in the early 1950s, it was replaced with a modernist building. And this was deemed inappropriate to tell the story of the harbor when the Commonwealth Games were on their way, and there was a huge effort to replace it with literally reconstruct or something approximating the original building. For the lecture today, I wasn't able to dredge up my slide of the building that we lost that long ago, but I would point out this rather marvelous proposal by David Hamilton in the upper right-hand corner here to reconstruct an evocation of the building around the steel structure of the replacement modernist one. And the opportunity perhaps we lost to actually reconstruct the post office when the new development came up. And as you can see on the lower right, this is now underway. And although claiming to be sympathetic to the customs house structure, which was preserved, will not be a reconstruction of the original building. So modernism and historic fabric comes into play quite often as we move through the various projects that have seen Old Town be restored, or parts of it restored. When Centennial Square was created, it was to be a mix of the modern and the new. It was to celebrate the city's history, but look forward to a sort of a rebirth, both economically and aesthetically, of a Victoria vision of the mayor of the day in the early 1960s, Richard Biggerstaff Wilson. So when it came to building the rest of the buildings in the square, renovating and restoring City Hall, it got a modernist insert when they filled in what had been the light well between the two wings of the city, finished around 1965. And as you can see down here, this was actually corrected by Nick Dolph in this case, who provided a new facade for the infill piece that utilized Teague's original Italianate scheme. Whoops. So you can see the sort of thinking behind the controversy when the proposal to preserve the Gold Rush warehouses came up a couple of years ago, where the proposal was to conserve the shells of the two historic structures, and so pay for it by inserting into it two four-story additions, compromising in the eyes of heritage conservationists, or reducing to facadism, their retention on the site and perhaps which drove even more controversy, compromising the sky, the view lines from over and from Old Town. The company that did this, Reliance, had a history of doing this in Vancouver with various degrees of success, depending on your point of view. And that's their headquarters in Vancouver. But in Vancouver, that's de rigueur, that's what they do. And Reliance is fairly good at doing that in that context. The argument here was, well, Victoria is not Vancouver. Similar dialogue took place with respect to the proposed but not yet done Ducks building at Wharf and Johnson, where the Duck building itself in the new scheme, or at least the front facade, is to be kept and restored. A large part of the building itself, not the whole thing, will be conserved. But the Canada Hotel, the corner building, which had lost a lot its Italian features and been kind of plastered over in the late 1940s, there was an opportunity to reconstruct the facade of the frontage of the original Canada Hotel. Instead, the design, and apparently this was a proposal on the table, but the design panel, and following what we might call as pure Venice Charter advice, is no, you can do something sympathetic, but it has to be distinguishable, not pretend to be a 19th century, part of the 19th century original block. So it looks like that's where that's heading. The irony of it is, it's right across the street. You've got David Hamilton's addition to the Best Western Carlton Hotel, which is the whole front block there, which was done in 1987 and continues, replicates, if you like, the Edwardian classical design of the original hotel block, which is right there. So a change of rules. Are we more pure? Are we more truthful? Or did we lose an opportunity to actually preserve, conserve, prepare a block, a Victorian block, which is an important part of Old Town. So it then comes to the treatment of historic buildings themselves, where a very important part, for instance, of the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association building, which is probably the most historic building in Chinatown, stands today naked, stripped of the balcony and gallery features, which was made it unique and an important part of the Chinatown balconied exterior distinguishing feature of that part of the city. And I do note actually recently, with a proposal to restore the building literally across the street, we might actually get a galleria back. But this, I think, awaits replication or reconstruction, call it as you will. With the fire hall on Yates Street, which was meticulously the facade restored by McBall, but we didn't get the tower back. And yet towers and spires were an important part of the Victorian picturesque aesthetic and distinguished Old Town. And should we not be putting back those elements? An opportunity awaits with the fire hall, perhaps. More recently, I look at Thomas Shotbolt's Druggist building, which is interesting because he started out, opened one of the early chemist shops in the city, the late 1870s, actually, and built a rather imposing looking building with its balconied gallery up front, and rose to prominence as a very important businessman. In fact, founding director with what we now call BC Hydro and BC Tel, as well as numerous other enterprises in the city, including the tramcar system. And as he rose to prominence, he wanted to improve the look of his shop. And so, my goodness, he did that. And so we got a new facade in the 1890s, much more prominent, telling you all about the fact that he's a chemist with his mortar and pestle up here, and a much grander finish. So the building fell on hard times. The top story was removed. The only part of it really visible as it stands today are the ornate cast iron columns. So the opportunity came to rebuild this building. I think it's Tom Moore, and he may be watching today. I noticed he was on the invitation list. And the city approved a modernist treatment with indeed the 4 columns, as you can see, and built into the new structure. But I found it, well, it's interesting from 2 points of view. First of all, one could argue that here was an opportunity to restore the contiguous historic street front of Wharf Street. And instead, of course, it has destroyed the contiguity of it, or at least not seized the opportunity to do that. And if you look at its design, actually, it is a facade. It's a screen applied to the building, and so it's screens or shades, balconies on the front. And so it's, in fact, you've got it's more of a kind of a Chinatown feature rather than what was the original 19th century lineup of these buildings that marched down the street in this way. Well, it could have been worse. And I just put this in and thought of I think this is in Amsterdam. I forget, it's either Amsterdam or Antwerp, where a modernist insertion in the cityscape compromises an otherwise historic run of buildings down the street. Redevivis, well, is there an opportunity to rebuild, to repair? And I notice the name repairs here. Go back to do some repairs. And of course, one site we're waiting for to come back out of the ground would be the West Home Hotel, or more recently the Plaza, which we lost to fire a little while ago, and whether or not that Edwardian facade on a new building could be replaced. Or if you look down on Wharf Street, our probably most famous celebrated historic ruin, which is the foundations of what was the Hudson's Bay Company warehouse, critical to the founding of Victoria, known actually by very few people other than historians and heritage folks, and still lacks some kind of interpretive material to tell you the actual importance of this wall in the history of the city. And with due deference to my colleague here today, showing Chris's proposal whereby perhaps the form of the original warehouse could be celebrated and memorialized in something that perhaps could accommodate a maritime museum.
So Martin and I are doing our own points of view in these presentations. No doubt there will be lots of other points of view and good discussion, but I thought I'd take a run at the urban planning and urban design aspect of kind of how cities evolve. And I thought I'd start with posing the question and the example of, can urban design really change or direct the destiny of a city? And the example that I've got, which I pulled out of the Midwest of the States, is the city of Indianapolis in Indiana, which is about the same size as Vancouver. It's kind of now known as kind of a Rust Belt, old industrial agricultural center. But in its early years, it really took some great urban design steps. It introduced the planning and design of a center point for the city. In the 1880s, they created this, I need the control here, central monument, which is the Sailors Monument, which was built over a generation from 1888 to 1901. It still remains a fantastic urban design landmark in the city, and it's extremely potent. The whole city kind of revolves around it. It is a period piece, but it's a period piece that really has lived on well. And again, this city, which otherwise would be kind of a flat plains, kind of serviceable utilitarian place, has elevated itself, turned itself into something really quite distinctive. They've really captured a fantastic identity, and they've carried that on with more urban planning in the city. So there's a lot of very fine urban design planning, generation after generation in Indianapolis. And the original Center Plaza has been the sort of the starting point for a lot of really fine urban design planning in the city through the 1920s and 30s, and even to contemporary times. You can see in the upper right hand that they've introduced a modern new landscaped urban waterway and canal as part of the structure of the city. So they're inspired by the original urban design. On the left, you see work from the 1920s and 30s with these wonderful plazas. They're a government city. I think it's the capital city of Indiana. So there's a lot of formal government buildings and government spaces included in their urban planning. And indeed, urban design has been very persuasive, and the investments they've made in it in the past have really given that city a great leg, and it's still a going concern. It's a challenged city right now because it's in that declining Midwest area of the States, but it's still holding itself proud. And the urban design dates back to the 1880s for the original monument in the city, still kind of gives guidance and a reference to the modern design of the city. So it's a real potent investment that good urban design can make in a community. Now, Victoria also has a very fine legacy of urban design planning. Centennial Square, which is a little down on its legs right now, was a fantastically celebrated urban design gesture for Victoria in the 1960s. It really brought international attention to the city. It balanced conservation of historic buildings with in scale, kind of mid-century modernism, brought all the local architects into play. And this fantastic fountain is a beautiful centerpiece, very artful, of kind of a mid-century kind of cultivation for an urban place. So we do have a really fine kind of history in Victoria of urban design, but it reaches back further, of course, to the original construction of the Inner Harbor area and the development of the harbor of the city. Rattenbury's work kind of envisioning this sort of urban center point still is a fantastic, kind of ground setting urban planning gesture for Victoria. And we still benefit from this work. The city created the Causeway, the Empress Hotel, and the legislature were all planted around this. And it's a great example that's celebrated internationally still of urban planning and urban design. And this is done more than a century ago, and it's still the key reference for the quality of our city, I think. And you can see the quality of the relationship of urban landscaping and formal buildings, as well as commercial buildings, all kind of rotating around the Inner Harbor. So Victoria definitely has a world-class example of a very fine Edwardian urban design that we're still drawing from. Arthur Erickson's firm did the Lower Causeway, which is very, very carefully inserted in the 1970s into the Inner Harbor area. So urban design is kind of self-sustaining if it's well done and cared for. And indeed, I think we're still looking to the Inner Harbor as our center point. It's our key introduction point, welcome mat for people coming to visit the city, but it's also should be an inspiration for urban planning and urban design as we move ahead. So we got lots to build on in Victoria. The other key feature, and I'm much with Martin in this,
the history of the city and the historic commercial core that we have in Victoria is remarkably well preserved. The Old Town area of Victoria is a real signature reference. So many cities have lost their old pedestrian-oriented historic cores. They sometimes have scraps of them. In Victoria, we've got the example of a complete precinct, and it's rare to find this in North America. Lots examples in Europe. You have to go to places like Quebec City, parts of St. John's, New Brunswick, some of the state cities down in the States, the historic cities still maintain their historic centers. Victoria, it really is a fantastic asset that we have, that we should not be reckless about. And the way a city can kind of tie back to its past and at the same time reach to its future is a question. In Victoria, we got the benefit. We developed slowly. Our economy has allowed us to keep this old historic area. It's still the forefront, I guess, in the downtown core. And we have an evolving, kind of growing downtown, and it's growing backwards and out around the old town, which I think is really appropriate. So the old town continues to be our kind of signature area, and you cannot replace areas like that with new development. So I think I'm very much with Martin that holding on to this historic mainstay is kind of a key objective for the quality of our city. Now, of course, I think times are changing. Early in the this century, early in the 2020s, we began to see a reemergence of kind of urban investment and urban development downtown. And the idea of more residency downtown. Victoria's downtown had been kind of, if you will, kind of prostrate for generations. And suddenly it has been rediscovered as an urban place. So the new investments began to, come into play in downtown. Fortunately, the planning was in place to keep those in some relationship to the old town. But at the same time, the city wanted to kind of more formally update their downtown planning. So I became involved as an urban design planner with the community planning division, and we worked on a new downtown plan. It was developed from around 2007 to 2011, and it's still in place. It was updated a number of times. We reviewed it. It went through a process of quite thorough public consultation and review, lots of input into it. And we really tried to figure out how to find a consensus for a good urban design and a good downtown core area plan. I think we did a fair job. The key essence of the plan is kind of shown in these two diagrams, urban design planning diagrams. In one of the earlier slides, I had put the question, well, can you design a city? Well, I think you can and you should. Lots of impulses and compulsions in the growth of a city, but I think having enlightened guidance and kind of big overviews, it really helps you channel all the energies of investment and growth and the demand for new housing and so on in the most beneficial way. So these two diagrams kind of give the key idea of how downtown Victoria can grow and still maintain really important inherent qualities. So the first diagram on the left is what we call the crosstown corridors, where we saw that new growth for the city could occupy underused land in two corridors, one particularly reaching to the north, south, and pulling land development up to the north to underused areas between Douglas and Blanchard. This is beginning to take form, and a secondary spine helping to fill in the areas of what we call the Harris Green area. All this was rotating around Victoria's kind of old-time main intersection, which was Douglas and Yates. Douglas and Yates were laid out by our first urban design planner, who was the original surveyor for Victoria, laid out the original town plan, Mr. Despard, and essentially he created two wider street right-of-ways on Douglas and Yates that met at the center point of the plateau that downtown was being developed on. He kind of foresaw something here. And in effect, that intersection became the signature main intersection downtown for generations. In my grandparents' day, you dress up and you meet people at the corner of Yates and Douglas and have your photographs taken. So there's a real history here, and we made that the kind of balance, the fulcrum point between the old city and the new city, the south city and the north city. And that now overlooked intersection, which at one time was the main area of pedestrian activity in the city, it kind of lies there waiting to be reawakened. And conceptually, it was kind of the hinge point, the rotation point for the idea of a crosstown form for the city. The other key diagram on the right is the idea of an urban amphitheater, where we saw the old low-scale harbor and the historic areas of the city maintained as kind of a low-scale basin in the middle of an amphitheater, and encouraged that new growth would surround that and kind of flank it. We create sort of a series of little skylines, mini in-scale skylines for Victoria, surrounding the inner harbor basin. So these two diagrams are really key diagrams, which I think are still critical for how we might see how the city evolves in the future. They encourage, allow growth. We were charged to plan for an additional 10,000 new housing units downtown, and this allowing for this type of growth was channeled in these directions. Really, we saw as the best way to maintain the historic city and activate underused real estate and bring more people into downtown and create a self-sustaining, populated downtown. Now, building height was also part of the discussion. And to accommodate the 10,000 people, we had to consider some ways to increase building height. And we did that in imagining that these two spines would be kind of a form of skyline of modest scale. You can see on the left is the city's diagram for allowable height. These were supposed to be maximum heights, all open to negotiation. They were basically allowances that could be brought into play. They were not entitlements of height. On the lower right, I did a diagram just showing the idea of this crosstown spine with the green lower basin in the middle, and then new development kind of creating a backdrop for the old city. I think this is still very important. Here's another diagram. This one shows the potential to encourage new growth in the Rock Bay area, and that's Blanchard Douglas Spine, and back into the Harris Green area, while generally maintaining the lower scale Old Town. So I think a number of us thought this is wise. It's a play between holding on to the past and reaching the future, keeping the old city kind of vital and pedestrian oriented and very familiar and popular, and a destination for our visitors, and complementing it with a new city. We also showed, this diagram, the objective of, going too quickly, of an inner harbor waterfront walkway. And in bits and fits and starts, we're seeing that built. But that was a key unifying element as well that we shouldn't lose sight of. Victoria, I would say, is still falling far short of what we should be doing with linking the waterfront areas to create a real wonderful forefront for the evolution of the core of the city. Nanaimo has been way more successful in creating a good waterfront walkway and passageway city. We really have to get going on this key element for the city. So the other challenge that we had to grapple with is, well, with new development, what does it mean in terms of the overall image and appearance of the city? So we were careful, I think, and again, there are lots of different points of view on this. We're careful to keep the old town and its characteristics, its terracing heights, low heights near the water, as the forefront and the recognized identity of Victoria, kind of internationally known. The Empress Hotel is part of that image of the city. And then as a kind of a constrained backdrop, we saw that the more modern backdrop of the city could grow in a complementary way with modest heights. So we were charged, well, what form would this take? And we talked about the idea of an undulating, kind of gradual hill-like backdrop skyline for Victoria, rather than a vertical surging skyline like you'd find in Calgary or in Toronto. And the idea of an undulating, gradual, kind of gradually developing backdrop skyline refers really well to the hilly landscape of Victoria. So how do we create a signature for the future? And one idea was that holding on to the historic city has been kind of very prominent, and then kind of a complementary and gradual kind of gentle backdrop. The other, I think, important idea was kind of a metropolis in miniature, where we had different districts in the city that were expressed distinctly. And we had the old historic area shown in brown, the modern downtown business district shown in kind of an off red color, modern residential area to the right, which is kind of our Harris Green area, and the inner harbor area, again, being a distinctive area and shown in blue here. And then the Rock Bay area, which is kind of an undiscovered frontier, shown in yellow. So each of these areas was intended to be distinctive in land use and also in character. And I think that gives you a lot more complexity and variety in the downtown center. So that concept's really important. Examples I look to cities like Portland, Maine, that have used this type of character area kind of definition. So looking ahead for the future of the city, the idea of clustering a series of distinct areas within a downtown core, so it's not uniform and there's a little bit of contrast and variety seems to be a good idea. So, I think this is a 3D view looking south over the Rock Bay area. And if you remember, we had that elliptical shaped basin over this area, as well as the Old Town area. I think part of the concept here was that the Rock Bay area has industrial character and history. So we thought, well, how could that fill out eventually with new buildings that make reference, I guess, to that type of era and type of history. So in this diagram, we studied the idea of a height range, 6 stories to maybe 8, 10 stories. You can achieve the same kind of densities you can achieve in high-rise buildings at this type of height and create an area that's much more reflective of the warehouse districts and the loft areas in older cities. Victoria's got some examples of those types of buildings. Recently, the Ironworks building built near Capel Iron, I think, is a really good example of a building that's well scaled, complements Old Town, makes reference to the industrial character of the Rock Bay area. So I think we kind of implanted in the plan the idea that Rock Bay could be a modern kind of complement to Old Town and to Chinatown at a modest scale, not a high-rise area. The high-rise, if you will, the 10 stories plus buildings would be up in the spine, up in the hill. They'd express the geography of stepping up from the harbor and provide a discrete background rather than inserting the high rises near the historic area. And again, we brought the idea of the harbor pathway around. Eventually, this could reach all the way around through the Rock Bay area up towards Bay Street. There's a fantastic view from Bay Street where you look right down to the bridge and to the legislature and to the Olympic Mountains behind. So there's an unused key urban vantage point, very Baroque, that we could take advantage of and make a real key point in an urban walkway system. Now, it could take a generation or more to create this walkway up to this point, but the planning and the idea of it, I think, is something to keep in mind even now. So Rock Bay, I think, is I know that there's proposals in Rock Bay. I'm very wary about exceeding this range of building heights. I think we can get all the densities, the number of residential units, and still come up with an area that's complementary to Old Town in Rock Bay. So that's my point of view. How the skyline is read, it's a modest increasing skyline. I think we have to study the skyline as bigger buildings and as a backdrop from the old city come into play, and think about materials and think about the variety of buildings. And again, hold to the idea of a modest height, gentle contour of a backdrop for Victoria that's somehow in balance with the historic forefront of the city. I don't have all the answers to this, but this is, I think, one of the challenges that as the city grows that we need to keep an eye on. I'm very concerned as well about streetscape. As we do allow taller buildings, one of the concerns we have in the downtown was making sure we kept a really strong relationship to how streets are framed in downtown. So as buildings start to lift up from our historic, 3 to 4 to 5 to 8-story range, we get taller buildings. How do we maintain a streetscape face that's in the range of the historic city? And many urban design planners have commented that the best range of enclosure for a street, right at the face of the street, is in the range of 3 to 5 stories. And some analysts have said that's where you get the most pedestrian activity. It's the best retail realm. It's a good range of heights in terms of the popularity of city streets. If you go to San Francisco, streets with those kind of height ranges, way more popular than the canyon streets. So we really wanted to step back taller building elements from that building street face enclosure. And at the same time, we also wanted to emphasize what's called secondary street walls, which are a mid-rise height. So instead of 3 to 5 stories, they're getting up, more from the 8 to 10 story range. Many urban commentators say the best, most active, most popular areas of cities anywhere in the world are typically the mid-rise areas of cities. Again, that's sort of the 3 to 5 story to 10 story range mixed together. So we saw a way to kind of emphasize mid-rise massing. It helps diminish the verticality of towers. And we did do a lot of study, have kind of built different building forms. We do not want to inhibit architecture. We wanted architects to really, strut their stuff and be as creative as possible within these overall urban design parameters. So the idea of, I did lots of diagrams showing the way step back buildings help diminish the impact of verticality, keeping to that range of streetscapes. Also, terracing buildings, I think, are really important in terms of Victoria's climate. A terrace setback building tends to diffuse air movement, downdrafts, and vortexes of wind blowing up and down streets. So in Victoria, it's quite windy and a bit moody weather in the winter. Stepping back the taller building forms and terracing down really help to moderate the scale of taller buildings and reflect the historic popular streetscapes that we know in the city, and also open more views to the sky. Ironically, stepping back taller buildings also is a benefit to the occupants because they have a broader street to look through rather than a narrow canyon street. So we studied the densities we were looking at in the growth of the city, and these setbacks do not inhibit the number of units we can build in the city. We had to do quite thorough reviews of the capacity of growth. Easily within the planning that was put in place, the city can well exceed the 10,000 new housing units using these building forms. So I'm very, very concerned that we don't lose this. I think the relationship of new development and the streetscape is really kind of important for the city. So I'm a real advocate of that. Also, kind of how we celebrate some of the, the real highlight urban areas in the city was of interest to us. And we did look at the Inner Harbor, particularly, which is such a very historic signature for Victoria. We thought, well, how can the Inner Harbor evolve and still retain the best of itself? So we wanted to keep the idea of the street wall enclosures around the Inner Harbor, sort of up to 6-8 stories, that range. We also looked at what can be done with the Empress Hotel. And I know there's different views on this. We had a run at the idea of adding a missing wing to the Empress Hotel, the south wing, which was never really designed or planned. But if you look at the building in the north wing, you can imagine a south wing eventually developing of the Empress. And the Empress Hotel, of course, is such a wonderful, landmark for the city. If you did add to the building, you can hold on to the sight lines and the kind of the way the forms of buildings are related in the original urban planning of the Inner Harbor area. There was a lot of interest in axes of views between the buildings and open areas between the buildings. Very formal. We saw that open landscaping is a big component. One idea we had was that the conference center behind the Empress could have a new addition put underneath the south wing, which would allow for more conference and exhibit spaces, which would be a big economic generator. Fantastic location in the city for that kind of use. It would serve the tourist industry, the museum, the provincial legislature. It would be a great location for a expansion of the conference center. And it could have a green roof, which would recall the gardens that surround the Empress. And then the wing of the Empress, the south wing, could help support the building economically. Sorry, my voice is getting a bit strained here. Yeah. So the other interest we had here was how we update and draw on the geometries that reflect the harbor. So one idea, which was a proposal for the city's 150th birthday, was a commemorative fountain, a floating fountain in the middle of the inner harbor, again tied into these urban design axes. Could be centered off the Empress and also centered off the CPR terminal. Could be anchored to float in place with a counterweight. And so it could go up and down. It could be illuminated, active fountain, kind of an update of what you see in the Empress Hotel. Now, the harbor is out of the city's hands. So this was a concept that would have to be involve the harbor authority, the federal government, and so on. But I still think it's a nice idea that could be an accent in the inner harbor. We also had a view observatory at the end of the wharfs. So you can do a lot, kind of step ahead carefully with the inner harbor. All the sidewalks and the streetscape around the inner harbor, I think, can be treated with more unity and updated. We have a lot of crumbling sidewalks. We really need to make this the real front door of the city in all ways. So another established area that I was interested in was Centennial Square. So we looked at the I guess the important urban design history of the square. It's a centennial project. It's one of the best remaining examples in Canada of what's now identified as centennial architecture and urban planning. Canada was full of these projects for the 67th centennial. Victoria had more centennials than any other city in Canada, and Centennial Square was kind of the apogee. It was the grand urban space celebrating centennialism, and we still have it. And it's now been recognized as a signature architectural idiom and era in Canada. So I think we have to be careful that there's a pedigree here that we need to conserve. But at the same time, as we know, it's not fully functional Centennial Square. We need to look at kind of bringing it in better life. One thought that my director, Mark Cornell, the community planning division had was, well, we need to bring transit and a kind of forefront to Centennial Square. So he set me off, and we looked at the idea of a transit pavilion as a frontage on Douglas Street for Centennial Square. And we said, well, could this become a loggia, an arrival pavilion to Centennial Square? So we did a little layout showing a plaza here. Some of these images have evolved from the time I was with the city, because I'm quite keen on this idea. So you'd have a key transit kind of stop-off point for Transit Victoria, which would also be a formal ceremonial kind of gateway into Centennial Square. Could have coffee shops, could even have some additional washrooms. We put additional washrooms in the end, and it would be kept at a low scale. It's in the geometry, geometric idiom of Centennial Square, and it would provide a gateway, a formal loggia. Many European squares have a Renaissance pavilion, which is called a loggia, which is a kind of political entry point. So here we are in the center of our political region, and we've got a formal gateway, which is also functional as a transit stop and has a couple of washrooms, which could be, in this example, were surrounded with glass block so that they could be lit up at night for safety and so on. So we're kind of looking at ways to update Centennial Square in this little study, and still for it to remain true to itself. The other opportunity in Centennial Square is to link the back of the square, if you will, to the Government Street Mall. And the studies right now getting underway to look at advancing the Government Street Mall. We've had plans for decades, since the mall was finished in the 70s, to extend it up to Chinatown and Centennial Square. I think that should be a priority. It's going to bring our visitors and our city residents right through into the downtown, the north sections of downtown, which are always struggling economically. So how you link the square to an extended Government Street Mall is a really interesting question. In Seattle, they've had squares which have run over streets. So the Westlake Mall in the middle of Seattle has a paved street, which is kind of visually part of a plaza. They cut off traffic at certain times when certain events happen, or they convert it back to traffic. So there's ways visually to connect the square with the Government Street Mall. So another example was I'm gonna have to speed up. Another example was the opportunity creating a plaza in Chinatown at the west end of Chinatown near Sora Street. There's an open, half of the blocks underused. So the idea was to kind of surround that available set of lots with housing, commercial uses, and create a Chinatown garden in the middle. That's still a potential for the city. Another study that I looked at, we had worked on the idea of overhead lighting and displays in Chinatown. Has worked out very well with overhead cabling. And the idea is, what about Douglas Street, our classic old main street? Could we update the presentation of Douglas Street? So we arrayed a cable system. The street lamp standards in Douglas Street are way out of date, and they're needing to be replaced. So we thought, well, could they be replaced with an updated lamp standard pole system that could have lighting and cabling across the street? This could be done over a period of time. Jumping back. So we had a quick look at how you could take highway standards and dress them up in terms of urban design with their own lighting and supporting a cable system. And you can take that classic intersection in the middle of Yates and Douglas where they intersect. And eventually this wouldn't be done sort of just off the cuff. There's a cost to do these kind of projects. But over time, you could kind of create a center point at Yates and Douglas. So I showed this ring above Yates and Douglas, again, supported by a decorative cabling system. The cabling system, of course, would be designed to be able to support seasonal decoration and lighting. Other cities have done these things. This is pretty grand scale for Victoria, but if you want to look ahead and do something with impact, this is the sort of way you can put urban design to use. The Maritime Museum commissioned me to look at a proposal to return to the law court building, the old Supreme Court House building in Bastion Square. And one of the things that this opened up was the idea of connecting Bastion Square to the Inner Harbor. So if the Maritime Museum reoccupied a portion of the old Supreme Court building, they'd still have a link down to the harbor, which could have display boats and so on, and could create a grand stairway as a link between the Bastion Square and the harbor. I think that's very opportune. The provincial government owns that land. At this time, the Maritime Museum also wanted a modern annex. They proposed sharing the courthouse with a city arts center, and that was the plan of the day a few years ago. I think this still kind of poses the question of what we do with Bastion Square and with the old Supreme Court House building, which is so historic in the square. So that's unanswered, but we had a look at it. I'm also very interested in urban waterfronts. So we did have a look at Ship Point, and I have a concern. I've done a little bit more work on this over the years. When the Maritime Museum was looking at just comparative sites, we looked briefly at Ship Point, potential for a site there. I'm really pleased that the current Maritime Museum objectives are to go into a harbor location in the old CPR terminal. If they can manage that, I think that's a great location. But over the long term, perhaps there's opportunity for a new Maritime Museum for, sometime in the future. So we looked at Ship Point. My concern with Ship Point is it's such a great site for urban festival events right now with its open landscaping. So my proposal was to maintain the flat open area to be used for for big events, for tall ship festivals and so on, not to encumber it with landscaping, and to still be able to use it as a kind of interim parking plaza for the winter and for evenings and so on. So at the same time, there's space enough there for a cultural building up against the retaining wall below 4th Street. Another waterfront site that we had looked at while I was with the city in terms of putting a cultural building on was the Vic West, west of the new Harbor Bridge, the old road right away. Mark Cornell and I said, well, what about if we put a proposal for Maritime Museum? This is way back. And I looked at the example in Vancouver of the cultural center in Cole Harbor, which is low grade and has a terracing amphitheater on top. So there could be potential to put a cultural building on this site as well as a park at the same time because of the drop in grades. So that was a study the day. And another key waterfront site. And again, I think waterfront sites are Victoria's, our strong hand of cards. We have really great underused waterfront sites that we could really turn to good purpose. One of the key sites, which is just staring us in the face, is the site of the old Hudson's Bay Company storehouse, below War Street. Now, on the upper left, you can see a painting of the warehouse when it was just completed in around 1858. You can see the old buildings of the Fort Victoria before they were torn down. This is a major step ahead for the Hudson's Bay Company, also for the province. Before it was a province, it was the first large commercial masonry building, I think, built in the province. And it really was a starting point for the development of modern Victoria. The Hudson's Bay Warehouse was a key commercial building in the city from 1858 to the early 1920s, when Hudson's Bay moved from it. It was eventually demolished in the 1930s. You can see the demolition happening, but it's a historic building for the evolution of urban British Columbia and Victoria as an urban place. So Martin's kind of put to all of us, well, what about rebuilding missing pieces? So Martin kind of got my wheel spinning, and we had a look at recreating the old warehouse in a modern form. I'm very sympathetic to the idea of all these underused waterfront sites having public cultural uses. I think that's a really prime kind of opportunity. And so the idea here was some kind of cultural facility, museum, meeting place, cultural. It could be almost any use. We didn't prescribe the use. Reusing the old Hudson's Bay Warehouse as a reference, historic reference. So we rebuild it in scale. In this example, I kind of did a glazed to kind of show it could be futuristic as well as historic. I did a glazed example. I moved it slightly south. It could work as a skylight for a two-story building underneath, again, with lots of ability for cultural uses or community uses. And again, a key link to the history of the city. So again, it's one of our prime historic sites. There it is. And how do we use it? I'm very worried that we do not turn these sites into large kind of view blocking commercial or residential developments. I think the best opportunity for Victoria is to ring the harbor, if you will, by really good public uses along the harbor. So in this image, I've got Ship Point, I've got the Hudson's Bay site, and they've all got lots of open public areas, and they've kept the views open to the harbor. They emphasize cultural and recreational uses. And you could surround the whole harbor looking at all these sites, these two sites, the sites up in Rock Bay and the Bridge West site, as opportunities for any type of array of cultural and recreational uses. There could be seniors facilities, there could be locations for music, for theater, for art, for museums, for Maritime Museum. Eventually, if you look at the long-term for Victoria, surrounding the harbor by active cultural uses, as well as maintaining the key functional transportation and some industrial uses, they can make our harbor the best it could be. European cities have turned their attention to doing this. Cities like Ottawa have used their waterfronts so well for cultural uses. I think as Victoria is no longer a big industrial center, we still have some industrial and commercial uses around the harbor. If we can complement them and intensify by the use of cultural facilities as well, I think that's really good urban design and planning for Victoria and optimizing our future. So that's my oar in the water. And we now have just a bit of time for discussions. Thank you. So I think if Nicole wants to open the platform for questions and comments, we've got 10 minutes or so, and that would be quite welcome. Well, one last thing, just while we're shutting down, that I will reiterate that Martin and I really thought that an ongoing urban design and urban planning and architectural forum for Victoria would be a great advancement for our community. This may be a toe in the water for that. So, let's keep the doors open. Again, we have our own points of view, and we really know that there's a lot of young designers and planners in the city, very creative. So for the city to be its best, I think having a good dialogue, good exchange of ideas is the very best thing.
think if anybody has any questions at this point or comments, it might just be easier for them to turn on their microphone and chat rather than doing it in the text and having to relay. So yeah, if anybody has anything to say.
Just one thought that came to me. Thanks for the presentation, Martin and Chris. I thought it was really great to just see, and especially in the context of Victoria. You know, I've only been here for 10 years, so there's still a lot I don't know. So it's fun to see, you know, a lot of the background and planning that's gone into the documents that we work with, you know, every day. One thought I had, and I've done a lot of thinking about this, and certainly in school more than in practice, around conservation and preservation and working with the, you know, ICAMUS and all the charters, is just, you know, how to avoid turning into like a Disneyland, you know, where you're kind of propping up the past and pretending the past and not really being of the present which we are now. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts around, you know, how do you respect the past, but not necessarily just go on repeating it in the same way, you know, kind of miming the past, while not necessarily addressing, you know, the valid changes that have happened in society and in architecture. You know, we don't build things the way they did back then. Is it really valid to say that we should be preserving and building new in exactly the same style when we could be respecting it and kind of working with it in a creative way that also speaks to the present? You know, I think of a lot of the kind of kintsugi or those kind of things where you're actually, you know, drawing a line between the old and the new, and composing it in a way that's respectful and of the same scale, and, you know, high quality materials, that kind of thing, without needing to necessarily mimic the past exactly. Just
I don't know what Chris thinks about this, because it's debated all the time. I think one of the big issues that heritage conservation today is trying to come to terms with, and I can see it's very difficult for people who actually design buildings to meet us in the street, as it were, when these discussions, you know, to where these discussions are evolving. But constantly now we're asking the question, why are we preserving, conserving, or restoring a building? And who are we doing it for? And so that's why I kind of put the public into the picture here. So what buildings do, you know, public buildings that have public faces, they tell stories, right? And they tell stories because they were built that way, and they were built by certain people. And they also tell stories that we lay on them. So I just think the questions we ask is, okay, so we understand about restoring a house, for instance, reasons why we want to do that. We understand why we might want to restore a whole monument. We understand that. But we often don't think of streetscapes as telling stories. And so the integrity of a streetscape is more than a series of conserved buildings, and it's more than an aesthetic object. I think that's the key. And all the other things, calling from a public point of view, fall in behind that. It's not about, well, we design things this way today. This is where we are, you know, or this is the aesthetic of the moment. And that's what we should be true to. I think, so it's not resolved. I mean, these issues are not resolved, but it's part of a intensifying conversation. And increasingly it's being directed by where the money is, so and where public interest is, and how those are intersecting. So that's my.
I'll make a comment or two. I'm very non-doctrinaire. I think that what Andy's talking about is very creative and progressive, but I think reconjuring the past and holding on to the past, I don't think that's immoral. In fact, I think the cities that I visit that are most interesting are very respectful of their past. And as Martin has demonstrated, many historic cities in Europe, which lost their histories, are desperately rebuilding them, literally. They're researching medieval and Renaissance Baroque buildings that were lost, and they're rebuilding them quite literally because they know that's the roots of their history. And I don't think that's immoral. I think, as I say, I'm non-doctrinaire. I think you need both things. Victoria has, our old town is a whole pressing though. So I think being careful about the identity of Old Town and complementary and filling in missing pieces, I think it's entirely legitimate. We are the equivalent of Quebec City here on the West Coast for Anglo-Canada. I think adding new architecture, especially in new areas, it accentuates the value of our history as well. So you kind of need it all, but judiciously.
A gardener.
Maybe there might also be, I guess, adding into that is that, our understanding of history changes, right? And what we make as significant might also evolve over time. Like it's a very kind of culturally specific way of interpreting the past. And like, I'm also, I definitely am up for preserving significant history, but kind of reflecting on what the significance is. And where do we draw the line as to what's significant, right? We have modernism that's significant. We have heritage, in the 1800s that's significant. Before that, we don't talk a lot about marking what was there before the colonial kind of invasion, right? So I think there is kind of a broader discussion around colonial buildings are what we're maintaining, and that's the character that's important, and that is the only way to define what the heritage is in the area. Which I think is maybe a bigger discussion. But it is a very pertinent discussion, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a very interesting one in terms of those of us looking at the notion of listing Victoria as a cultural landscape, because in fact, current research is showing that the underpinnings, the geology and geographical underpinnings, the landforms of the city that have deep meaning for First Nations people, actually to a large degree have driven the layout and design of the city. So the preservation, for instance, of views and landscape features with native planting, particularly hills and what we call mountains, is very important. And the form of the harbor and how we in future preserve or enhance the harbor, and particularly making sure it's linked to the gorge waterway, which is all part of the same system. And we've been in fact in discussions with some of our First Nations partners about doing this. Of course, the other way to do it, as City of Victoria has started to do quite successfully, is to celebrate it through contemporary art commissions. So you have to kind of take this holistic view. And as you say, it's not just the colonial history. And in fact, recognizing how the colonial history indeed intersected with what came before it is an important part of the dynamic of this.
Yeah, I think this is an evolving challenge. Times change and so on, and I think we have to be careful, to reach into the depths of our history. The Hudson's Bay Company warehouse building, I think, is a really good example of a building that was an interface building between the First Nations occupants who helped build it apparently, and the Hudson's Bay Company. And it brought a lot of prosperity initially to the First Nations, which unfortunately did not continue properly. But there was a point where the two cultures were kind of in balance. And apparently the construction of the warehouse was enthusiastically participated in by the First Nations, who were primary artisans and so on building it. So they've got a bit of a history on that side of things, on each side of the line, if you will. And for sure, we have to examine, the ups and downs of history and the pros and cons. And, there's always people whose advantages get diminished, as we know, and it's time for respect and kind of other points of view in relationship to that. So reinterpreting history is dynamic. We have to be careful not to throw our history away though, and just say, oh, that was a tough period that we need to sanitize. I think the whole picture is important. And Victoria, we're really lucky that we've got this existing cultural landscape that so many cities have lost, which pose all these questions. So I think history is an asset in that way, but it does need to be reevaluated and looked at from different points of view, and also given counterpoints. Like you say, modern design is just as important to Victoria as its history, but it has to, you know, how do you keep the right balance and the right dynamic? I don't have all the answers, but that's the question.
Great presentation from both of you. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to point out that CBC, I think it was yesterday, profiled an article in their post online regarding the importance of maintaining our heritage buildings in whole in the interest of what we're going to be dealing with in our next month's presentation, which is climate change. And the argument in the whole article was that tearing down our old buildings contributes a huge amount of CO2 emissions in the process, and at all costs should be avoided if there's a way of retaining the building in whole, not just the facade, but the whole building, and renovating or restoring the building in the interest of a future use. So I just throw that out. You may be able to catch that article online looking at CBC's news site. So just add that to the bit of a sidebar point, but it does contribute to our next session.
We really thank you for kind of allowing Martin and I to bring our, you know, our rattle traps into play here. And we know there's lots of other points of view, but at the same time, I think, you know, we've both been in the city quite a while, and we both are a bit nervous about the city being, our community kind of taking care, I guess, with change. I'm on the side with Martin, where I think more protection, I think, of the history of the city. We really need to be very, very thorough about that. And we have lots of opportunity for the city to flourish and grow and economically expand using underused areas of the city. There's definitely a good urban economy there. And if you look at cities that are doing that well, Montreal, Quebec City, and so on, they really benefit. So that's the message, I think, from my point of view. I guess from Martin's point of view, but the debate will definitely go on, which is a good thing. Thank you all very much. Thanks to Martin.
And thank you all, yeah, for staying with us.